In 2023, a trail camera bolted to the trunk of a white oak about 3 miles above the Buffalo River in Newton County, Arkansas, recorded something that its owner had been waiting more than 50 years to see again. The camera was infrared. The recording was made deep into the early hours of a cold morning in late October, and what it captured, moving through the hardwood bottoms of an Ozark hollow on 2 legs, matched something the owner of that camera had last seen in the winter of 1967, inside a steel cage, on a flatbed trailer parked in a field behind a livestock barn outside of Jasper. The footage is brief. It is recorded from a distance, through trees, in conditions that make detail difficult to resolve, but the shape is unmistakable to anyone who has studied the Dogman phenomenon. Upright, broad through the chest and shoulders, a head that is wrong for anything walking on 2 legs, and a stride that covers ground with a confidence that belongs to whatever owns the terrain it is crossing. The man who set that camera has been carrying a story for over half a century that he has never told publicly until now. It is the story of what his family caught in a trap in the fall of 1967, what they did with it, what it did to them when it got free, and why 3 men died on a piece of ground in the Arkansas Ozarks that nobody in Newton County has been willing to talk about since. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. His name is not the one we are going to use. He agreed to talk to us on the condition that his real name stay out of it. And given what he told us about the consequences his family faced after the incident and the way the community handled the aftermath, his reasons are clear. We will call him Merle. He is in his early 70s now, lives alone on a piece of family land in the hills south of the Buffalo River, and he has spent most of his adult life within a few miles of the place where everything happened. He came back to Newton County after years away because the land was his and because the thing he saw as a boy never left him. The specific details of his family and his career are things we are leaving vague because Newton County has a population of about 7,000, and in a county that small, the wrong combination of details will identify a person faster than a name will. What you need to know about Merle is that he grew up in a family that ran a small traveling animal exhibition through the Ozarks from the late 1950s through 1967. This was not a circus in the way most people picture one. There were no elephants, no trapeze artists, no big top. What his family operated was closer to a roadside attraction on wheels, a collection of caged animals hauled on flatbed trailers from county fair to livestock auction to small-town festival across a circuit that covered southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, and the eastern edge of Oklahoma. They displayed bears, wolves, bobcats, snakes, and whatever oddity they could trap that would draw a paying crowd. Shows like this were common across rural America in the 50s and 60s, especially in the Ozarks, where a caged bear was worth $0.25 at the gate. The family had been doing it for going on a decade by the time Merle was old enough to help, which put him in the middle of the operation by the time he was 12 or 13. Newton County, Arkansas, where the family was based and where the incident occurred, is a place that most Americans have never heard of and that most Arkansans think of as the end of the road. The county sits almost entirely within the Boston Mountains, the southernmost and most rugged range of the Ozark Plateau. The terrain is steep. Limestone bluffs over 500 feet tall drop into hollows so narrow that sunlight reaches the bottom for maybe 3 hours a day in winter. The Buffalo River, which would become the first national river in the United States when Congress designated it in 1972, cuts through the northern part of the county from west to east, carving a canyon through sandstone and limestone that has been forming for over 400 million years. Highway 7 runs north to south through Jasper, the county seat, and it is considered one of the most scenic drives in the country, though scenic is a word that does not capture what Highway 7 actually feels like at night, in the fog, when the road drops off the edge of a ridge and you cannot see the bottom of the hollow below you, and the forest presses in from both sides like walls. The Ozark National Forest covers most of the county. The Upper Buffalo Wilderness, nearly 11,000 acres of federally designated wilderness, sits in the southwestern portion. Human population density outside of Jasper and the handful of communities strung along the highway is close to 0. In 1967, the valley was farmland and timber, and the forest on either side of it was as close to untouched wilderness as anything left east of the Rockies. Merle was 15 in the fall of 1967. He had been working the animal show for 3 years by then, handling the feeding, the watering, the cage cleaning, the loading and unloading of the trailers. He knew the animals the way you know coworkers you see every day. He could read their moods by posture and sound. He knew which bear would bluff charge the cage bars when strangers got close and which one would sit in the corner and ignore everything. He knew how the wolves paced when a storm was coming and how they went still and watchful when a coyote howled from the ridgeline after dark. He was not afraid of the animals. He had grown up with them. They were his normal. His father ran the show. 2 other men worked the operation. A man Merle described as a family friend who had been with the show since it started, and a hired hand who joined in the mid-60s and handled the heavy lifting, the truck driving, and the equipment maintenance. These 3 men were the handlers. They were the ones who moved cages, repaired enclosures, loaded trailers, and dealt with any animal that got aggressive or sick or difficult. Merle helped, but the 3 of them did the dangerous work. The physical work of managing caged wild animals in field conditions, with equipment that was held together by welding and improvisation rather than engineering, was work for grown men with strong backs and a tolerance for risk that most people would consider reckless. The family owned a piece of land south of the Buffalo River, in the hills above what is now part of the National River Corridor, accessible by a dirt road that climbed from the bottomland near Boxley Valley up into the ridgelines. The land had been in the family for generations. There was a house on it, a livestock barn, a fenced field, and beyond the fence, nothing but Ozark forest running unbroken for miles in every direction. The animals were kept on this property between shows, housed in a row of heavy cages behind the barn. The property was the base of operations, the winter quarters, and the place where the family trapped new animals to add to the collection. Trapping was part of the business. When a bear died or a wolf got too old to display, replacements had to be found. Merle's father had been trapping since boyhood. He ran steel cage traps, the kind used by state wildlife agencies to live capture bears, big rectangular steel and wire enclosures baited with rotten fruit and bacon grease, triggered by a plate mechanism that dropped a heavy gate when the animal stepped on it. The traps were set in the hollows where bear sign was heavy and checked every morning. Most of what the traps caught was released. The family kept only healthy adults that could tolerate captivity. In September of 1967, Merle's father and the family friend set a bear trap in a hollow about 4 miles south of the property, in a drainage that fed into a tributary of the Buffalo River. The hollow was deep, steep-sided, choked with hardwoods and underbrush, and accessible only by a trail that followed the creek bed. Bear sign in the area had been heavy that fall. Scat, claw marks on trees, overturned logs where bears had been digging for grubs. They baited the trap and left it. 3 days later, when Merle's father hiked down to check the trap, it was sprung. The gate was down. Something was inside, but the sounds coming from the cage were wrong. A bear in a trap makes specific noises. It huffs. It pops its jaws. It paces and sometimes roars, a deep-chested sound that carries through the hollow and scatters everything else into silence. What Merle's father heard coming from that trap was a vocalization he had never encountered in over a decade of trapping bears and wolves in the Ozarks. A low, continuous sound that rose and fell in cycles, somewhere between a growl and a structured call, like a pattern being repeated. He told Merle later that the sound stopped him on the trail 100 yards from the trap, and he stood there listening for a long time before he went closer. When he reached the trap, what he saw inside was something he could not identify. The creature was large. It filled the trap in a way that a bear of comparable mass would not, because it was not shaped like a bear. The body was upright even inside the confined space, hunched forward against the cage ceiling, which was about 4.5 feet at the apex. The limbs were long. The hands, and Merle's father used the word hands when he described them later, were gripping the wire mesh of the cage wall. The head was the thing that made no sense. Elongated, a muzzle projecting forward from the skull, ears standing upright, pointed, set high on the head, eyes that caught the morning light filtering through the canopy and reflected it back with a yellowish tint that was closer to a dog's eye shine than anything in the bear family. The body was covered in dark fur, nearly black, dense through the chest and shoulders, thinner on the limbs. Merle's father crouched in front of that trap for a long time. He was not a man who scared easily. He had trapped bears that outweighed him by 300 pounds and handled them with nothing but a catchpole and a calm voice. But he told Merle that what was in that cage looked at him in a way that no animal he had ever trapped had looked at him. It watched him. It studied his face, his hands, his posture. It tracked his movements with an attention that felt like assessment rather than fear. He hiked out and came back with the other 2 men and a truck. They backed the truck down the creek bed as far as it would go, then used a hand winch to drag the cage trap, with the creature inside, up to the truck bed. The creature did not fight during the move. It went still. It crouched low in the cage and watched the men work. Merle's father said later that the stillness was worse than fighting would have been because it felt deliberate. An animal in a trap fights or freezes in terror. This thing went still the way a man goes still when he is watching a situation develop and waiting to see what happens next. They hauled it back to the property and parked it behind the barn. That afternoon, Merle came home from school and his father told him to come look at something. Merle walked behind the barn and saw the cage trap sitting on the truck bed, and inside the cage, something he had never seen before. Something that did not belong in any field guide or any chapter of the natural history books he had read in the school library in Jasper. Merle described the creature to me across multiple phone calls, and his descriptions were consistent in every detail across every conversation, which is one of the markers that separate credible witness testimony from fabrication. The creature was between 6.5 and 7 feet tall based on how it fit inside the cage, though it was difficult to measure precisely because it never stood fully upright while confined. The shoulders were roughly 3 feet across. The arms were long, reaching past the hips, with forearms that were thick and heavily muscled. The hands had 5 fingers, including what appeared to be an opposable thumb, with dark curved claws at the tips that were longer and thicker than a dog's nails but shaped similarly. The legs had a forward bend at the knee, more like the hock of a large dog but adapted for bipedal stance. The feet were large, roughly 10 or 11 inches long based on later prints, with a canid structure of pads and claws. The head was the part that stayed with Merle. The muzzle projected forward 6 or 7 inches from a skull wider than a human's. The jaw was heavy, with pronounced canines visible even when the mouth was partially closed. The ears stood erect, pointed, rotating independently like a shepherd's ears. The eyes were set forward, predator positioning, irises a pale amber. This was the fall of 1967. Merle was 15 years old, had never heard the word Dogman, had no frame of reference for what he was looking at. The internet did not exist. Steve Cook's song The Legend would not be recorded for another 20 years. Linda Godfrey's Beast of Bray Road article was still over 2 decades away. The creature in the cage was, as far as Merle and his family knew, a creature nobody had ever seen or described. It was unique, it was extraordinary, and it was worth money. Merle's father made the decision to keep it. From a business standpoint, the logic was straightforward. The animal show earned its money by displaying things people had never seen before, and nobody who walked up to that cage was going to look at what was inside and say they had seen one before. The family built a new enclosure. They reinforced a section of a livestock trailer with welded steel plate and heavy-gauge wire mesh, creating a cage roughly 8 feet long, 5 feet wide, and 6 feet tall, bolted to the bed of the trailer and secured with a sliding door mechanism that locked with a steel pin. The cage was stronger than anything they used for the bears. Merle's father was not stupid. He understood that whatever was in that trap was powerful, and the enclosure had to be built to hold a creature capable of bending the steel wire mesh of a standard bear trap with its bare hands, which it had already demonstrated. They transferred the creature from the trap to the new cage on the second day. This required all 3 men and took the better part of an hour. The creature did not cooperate, but it did not attack. It resisted passively, bracing itself inside the trap, gripping the mesh, making itself as difficult to move as possible without lashing out. When the transfer was complete and the sliding door locked into place, it stood in the new cage and looked at each of the 3 men in turn. Merle was watching from the barn doorway. He said the creature's gaze moved from one man to the next, slowly, deliberately, with a focus that he associated now, looking back on it with over 50 years of perspective, with memorization. It was learning their faces. The family kept the creature for 18 days. In that time, Merle was the one who fed it and brought water twice daily, in the morning before school and in the evening before dinner. His father assigned him the job because Merle was the smallest and the least threatening, and the creature seemed to tolerate his presence more than it tolerated the men. Merle would approach the cage with a bucket of water and a pan of raw meat, usually whatever the family had from a recent deer kill, and slide the food and water through a slot at the base of the cage door that was just wide enough for the pan and the bucket handle. The creature would watch him approach. It would stand at the back of the cage with its head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on Merle, and wait until he had placed the food and stepped back before it moved forward to eat. It ate quickly and efficiently. It drank the water in long pulls, tilting the bucket with one hand and pouring with a control that Merle said was the first thing that truly frightened him about it. A bear drinks by pushing its face into a water source. A wolf laps. This thing picked up the bucket and drank from it. The creature used its hands constantly. It gripped the cage bars and tested them, methodically, one bar at a time, applying lateral pressure as if checking for weakness. It ran its fingers along the seams where the welded plates met the mesh. It examined the door mechanism, the sliding track, the steel locking pin. Merle watched it reach through the mesh and touch the outside of the locking pin, wrap its fingers around it, and pull. The pin held, but the creature tried it every day that Merle observed, always with the same measured, deliberate motion. It was not rattling the cage in frustration. It was testing a specific component of the enclosure with what Merle described as purpose. During the second week, Merle's father displayed the creature at 2 events. The first was a small gathering at a livestock barn in a community south of Jasper, a swap meet and animal show that drew maybe 60 or 70 people from the surrounding hollows. The creature was in its cage on the trailer, covered with a tarp until the family pulled it back and let people look. Merle said the reaction was immediate and physical. People stepped back. A woman screamed. Several men went to their trucks and came back with rifles, which Merle's father talked them out of using. The crowd stood at a distance of about 20 feet and stared. A few people moved closer. The creature stood at the back of the cage and watched them the same way it watched everything, with that level, assessing attention that felt less like an animal being observed and more like an intelligence taking notes. One man asked Merle's father what it was. His father said he did not know. The man asked where he caught it. His father told him. The man went quiet and then said his grandfather had told him about things in the deep hollows that people did not talk about, things the old-timers knew to leave alone. He said his grandfather had a word for them that he would not repeat in mixed company. Then he left. Merle said nobody at any of these showings tried to name what they were looking at, but several people, older men and women who had lived in the Ozarks their entire lives, reacted not with surprise but with recognition. They looked at the creature, and something settled in their faces. It was confirmation. By the end of the second week, the creature had changed. The passive resistance of the first days had shifted into a different register. It was more active in the cage, moving more, testing the bars with greater force, spending long periods examining the door mechanism. It had also started vocalizing at night. Merle's bedroom was in the back of the house, maybe 150 yards from the barn where the cage was parked. And after dark, the creature would produce sounds that carried through the hollow with a clarity that the hills amplified. The vocalizations were not howls. They were structured sequences of low-frequency tones that rose and fell in patterns. They repeated, they varied, they had, Merle said, the cadence of speech without any recognizable language. And they were loud. On the 3rd or 4th night of the vocalizations, Merle's father walked out to the barn with a flashlight and stood in front of the cage. The creature was pressed against the back wall, head tilted upward, producing the sounds from deep in its chest. When the flashlight beam hit it, it stopped. It looked at Merle's father, and then it did something that none of them had seen it do before. It struck the cage door with both hands, a single explosive impact that rang the steel plates like a bell and shook the trailer on its springs. The locking pin held. Merle's father went back to the house and did not sleep that night. On the 15th day, something answered the creature's calls. Merle heard it. He was lying in bed, listening to the creature's nightly vocalizations as he had grown accustomed to doing, when a second voice came in from the ridgeline to the south, the same kind of sound, the same tonal range, the same structured patterns, but from a different source, at least a half-mile away, up on the high ground above the property. The creature in the cage went silent. Then it answered, a single sustained vocalization that vibrated in Merle's chest, even through the walls of the house. Then the voice from the ridge responded, and the two of them went back and forth. 3 or 4 exchanges, before silence fell and did not break again that night. Merle told his father the next morning. His father said he had heard it too. He did not say anything else about it, but Merle noticed that his father checked the cage 3 times that day, inspecting every weld, every bar, every bolt, and tightening the locking pin with a wrench until the threads bit. That evening, the family friend who worked the show came to the house and sat in the kitchen with Merle's father and talked in low voices while Merle sat in the next room and listened through the wall. The family friend said they needed to let it go. He said what was answering from the ridge was going to come looking for what was in the cage, and he did not want to be standing next to that cage when it did. Merle's father said he needed to think about it. The family friend left. Merle went to sleep. He woke to a sound he had never heard before and has never heard since. A metallic crash that combined the shriek of steel being torn and the low percussion of something massive hitting the ground. Then shouting, his father's voice, the family friend's voice, higher and panicked. And underneath it all, a sound that Merle described as breathing, except the breathing was huge, like a bellows, and it was coming from whatever had been in the cage and was now free. Merle got out of bed and went to the window. The yard light on the barn was on, a single bulb that threw a circle of yellow light across the gravel between the house and the barn. In that light, he could see the trailer. The cage door was open. The steel locking pin, which his father had tightened with a wrench that afternoon, was out. The door was slid back on its track and hanging off the end of the rail, half detached, and the creature was standing in the yard. It was the first time Merle had seen it at full height outside the cage. It was taller than he had estimated. The top of its head cleared the 7-foot mark on the barn door frame as it turned. The body was heavier than it had looked in the cage, where the confinement compressed its posture. Standing free, it was wide and deep through the chest, with shoulders that rolled when it moved and arms that hung past its thighs. It stood on legs that were bent at the knee in that canine angle, balanced on the balls of its feet, and even standing still it looked capable of covering 50 yards before you finished drawing a breath. Merle's father was in the yard. He had a flashlight in one hand and a rifle in the other, a lever-action .30-30 that he kept by the back door. The family friend was behind him, holding a lantern. The hired hand was coming around the side of the barn from the equipment shed, carrying a shovel because it was the closest thing he could grab. 3 men, 3 handlers, the men who had trapped it, caged it, hauled it, displayed it, and stood next to its enclosure every day for 18 days while it watched them and learned their faces. The whole thing took less than a minute. Merle saw it from his bedroom window, roughly 50 yards from the barn, and his account of the sequence is as clear and specific as anything I have heard from a witness in years of working in this field. The creature moved toward the hired hand first. The hired hand was the closest, coming around the corner of the barn into the yard light, and the creature closed the distance between them with a speed that Merle said made the word fast feel inadequate. It covered maybe 30 feet in what seemed like 2 strides. The hired hand swung the shovel. The creature caught the shovel handle with one hand and struck the man with the other. Merle did not see the details of the impact. He saw the man go down and not get back up. Merle's father raised the rifle and fired. The shot hit the creature somewhere in the body. Merle heard the impact, the wet thud of a bullet striking mass. The creature turned toward his father, and whatever the .30-30 round did to it, it did not stop it, and it did not slow it down appreciably. It reached Merle's father before he could cycle the lever for a second shot. Merle looked away. He heard sounds he will not describe, and does not need to describe for you to understand what a 350-pound bipedal predator with claws and canine teeth does to a man holding a rifle he cannot fire fast enough. The family friend ran. He made it about 20 yards toward the house before the creature reached him. Merle saw that one clearly because it happened directly below his window, in the full throw of the yard light, and the image of it has been with him for 57 years. The creature picked the man up, lifted him off the ground with both hands, and put him down in a way that was final. 3 men. The 3 who had trapped it, built its cage, locked the pin every night, hauled it to shows, and stood in front of its enclosure while crowds stared. Every handler. The creature killed every handler who was present on that property, and it did so with a speed and a precision that Merle, even at 15, recognized as targeted rather than random. It knew who they were. It had spent 18 days watching them. It had memorized their faces, and when the cage door opened, it went for them specifically, and in an order that suggested tactical thinking, taking the closest threat first, then the armed threat, then the one trying to flee. Then it stopped. Merle was standing at his window. The yard light was on. The creature was in the yard, maybe 40 feet from the house, and Merle was looking directly at it. It turned and looked up at the window, at him, the boy who had brought the water and the food every morning and every evening for 18 days. Merle said they looked at each other for what felt like 10 or 15 seconds, and in that time, the creature did nothing. It stood in the yard with the bodies of 3 men around it, and looked at the 15-year-old boy in the window and made a decision. The decision was to leave. It turned away from the house. It dropped to all fours in a motion that Merle described as liquid, a flowing transition from upright to quadrupedal that looked like a single continuous movement rather than a change in posture. And it ran, across the field, over the fence, and into the tree line on the south side of the property, heading uphill toward the ridgeline where the answering calls had come from 3 nights earlier. The sound of it crashing through underbrush lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then the hollow was silent in a way that silence is not supposed to feel, heavy and pressing and full of a change that could never be undone. Merle did not go outside. He stayed at the window until dawn. His mother was not on the property that night. She was staying with a relative in Jasper, a circumstance that Merle believes saved her life, though whether the creature would have entered the house is something he has turned over in his mind for decades without reaching an answer. When the sun came up, he walked out the back door and saw what was in the yard and understood that his childhood was over and his father was dead and nothing about his life was ever going to be the same. The county sheriff arrived that morning after Merle walked to a neighbor's property and used their phone. The sheriff brought a deputy and the county coroner. They examined the scene. They examined the bodies. They examined the cage, the trailer, the broken door mechanism, the locking pin that had been pulled from its track and bent at a 90-degree angle, which would have required force that no human hand could generate and no animal in the Arkansas wildlife catalog could produce. The coroner documented the injuries. He noted, in his official report, that the cause of death for all 3 men was consistent with an animal attack. He listed the animal as a black bear. There was no investigation beyond the initial scene assessment. A black bear escaping from a poorly secured cage on a private animal exhibition and killing 3 people was tragic, but in Newton County in 1967, it was also understandable. Black bears were common. The animal show was known to locals. The cage was clearly inadequate for a large animal. The story wrote itself, and nobody who read the coroner's report had any reason to question it because nobody in Newton County who read that report had ever imagined an alternative. Merle told the sheriff what he had seen. He described the creature. The sheriff listened, looked at the 15-year-old boy who had just watched his father die, and told him that what he saw was a bear, that the trauma had distorted his perception, and that in time he would understand that. The sheriff was not being cruel. He was doing what people do when confronted with information that does not fit inside any framework they possess for understanding the world. He discarded it. The Newton County Times ran a brief item in the back pages. 3 sentences. Animal escape at local exhibition. Fatalities. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission sent an officer 3 days later. He documented the damaged cage, noted the absence of a state permit, and closed the case with a recommendation that the remaining animals be surrendered to the state. The family complied. The operation was finished. Nobody came looking for the creature. Nobody organized a search. Nobody contacted the state wildlife agency to report that something unidentified was loose in the hollow south of the Buffalo River. The official record said a bear had escaped, killed 3 men, and fled into the forest. Bears do that. The case was closed, and the creature that had been in that cage, the thing that had pulled a steel locking pin from its track with its bare hands and killed 3 men in under a minute, and then looked at a 15-year-old boy and decided to let him live, walked back into the Ozark wilderness and disappeared. Merle's mother moved them to Little Rock within a month. The land sat in probate. The house stood empty. Merle finished high school in Little Rock, worked odd jobs around central Arkansas, and came back to Newton County in his mid-20s because the land had finally cleared probate and was his, and because he had never stopped thinking about what was in those hollows. The terrain Merle came back to was the same terrain the creature had disappeared into. The Boston Mountains are a dissected plateau, ridge tops above 2,000 feet, hollows dropping 1,000 feet to creek bottoms choked with hardwoods so dense that off-trail travel requires a machete. The limestone bedrock is riddled with caves. Bluff shelters that sheltered humans going back 9,000 years are scattered throughout. There are hollows in the southern part of the county where you could walk for days without crossing a road. That is where the creature went, and that is where Merle has spent the better part of 45 years documenting its continued presence. If you have spent time in the Buffalo River country, if you have hiked the trails around Ponca, or floated the upper river between Boxley and Steel Creek, or camped in one of the dispersed sites along the forest roads in the southern part of the county, you know the kind of terrain I am describing. You also know that once you leave the river corridor and the maintained trails, the forest closes in fast and the ridgelines and hollows can swallow you completely. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen out there, because the reports I've been pulling together from Newton County and the surrounding area go back a lot further than most people realize, and they describe something consistent enough to be difficult to ignore. Merle did not begin his documentation work immediately after returning to Newton County. For the first several years, he focused on making the property livable, repairing the house, clearing the access road, building a life in a place that held the worst memory of his childhood. He took a job with a local outfit that did timber and fence work across the county. He hunted deer in the fall and fished the creeks in the summer. He lived quietly and did not talk about what had happened in 1967. The first sign that the creature, or something like it, was still in the area came in the spring of 1978, about 3 years after Merle's return. He was walking the fence line on the south boundary of his property, checking for damage from winter ice, when he found tracks in a muddy seep near the tree line. Large canid tracks, bipedal stride pattern. He measured them as best he could with a pocket tape. The measurements were consistent with what he remembered from the prints the creature had left in the yard on the night it escaped, which he had examined in the dawn light before the sheriff arrived, and which had burned into his memory along with everything else from that night. The tracks led south, uphill, into the hollow where his father had originally set the bear trap 11 years earlier. He did not follow them. He stood at the tree line and looked into the hollow and listened. The woods were quiet in a way that he recognized, the same absent quality that a forest takes on when something large is present and everything else has moved aside. He went back to the house and sat on the porch and thought about what the tracks meant. They meant it was still there, or something like it was still there, in the same drainage, on the same ground, within a few miles of where it had been captured and where it had killed his father and the 2 other men. Over the following decades, Merle accumulated evidence the way a person accumulates scars, slowly and without choosing to. He found tracks intermittently, always on the southern portion of the property or in the forest just beyond the fence line, always in soft substrate after rain, always with the same bipedal canid characteristics, always leading south into the deep hollows. He found trees marked with claw gouges, vertical scratches running from 4 feet to over 7 feet on the trunk, in groups of 4, deep enough to cut through bark into the cambium layer. He found deer carcasses in the woods with injuries that did not match bear or coyote predation, clean kills with broken necks and single throat wounds that implied a predator working alone with speed and precision. He heard the vocalizations. At irregular intervals, usually in the fall, usually between midnight and 3 in the morning, the same structured low-frequency sounds that the creature had made in its cage would drift up from the hollows to the south and carry across the ridge where his property sat. Sometimes a single voice, sometimes 2. The sounds would go on for 20 or 30 minutes and then stop. Merle started keeping a journal in 1983. He wrote down every observation, every track find, every marked tree, every vocalization, with dates and locations marked on a United States Geological Survey topographic map of the Jasper Quadrangle that he kept tacked to the wall of his office. Over 4 decades, that map accumulated hundreds of marks, and the marks formed a pattern. The activity was concentrated in a drainage that ran from the ridgeline south of his property down into a series of interconnected hollows that fed eventually into a tributary of the Buffalo River. The territory, as far as Merle could map it, covered roughly 30 square miles of some of the most inaccessible terrain in Newton County. The boundaries followed terrain features, ridgelines, and creek drainages, the same natural corridors that every large predator uses to define and patrol territory. He set his first trail camera in 2006, when affordable infrared trail cameras became available at sporting goods stores in Harrison, the nearest town of any size, about 30 miles north of Jasper on Highway 7. He lost the first 3 cameras within weeks. They were pulled from trees, the housings cracked, the mounting straps torn through the bark. The destruction pattern matched what Dogman researchers in Michigan and Wisconsin have documented for years. Cameras found and removed by a creature that understood what they were and did not want them operating in its territory. Merle adapted. He learned to conceal cameras inside natural features, tucked into hollow logs, wedged into rock crevices, mounted inside the broken crowns of dead trees. The concealed cameras lasted longer. Some of them captured footage before they were found and destroyed. The footage Merle has accumulated over 17 years of camera work consists of over 30 clips, most of them infrared, most of them brief, most of them showing a dark shape moving through the forest at night at a distance that makes fine detail difficult to resolve. A few clips are longer and clearer. The 2023 clip that I described at the opening of this story is the clearest of all, captured at roughly 60 yards through a relatively open stand of hardwoods, showing a bipedal figure moving across the frame with a stride that covers ground the way nothing in the Arkansas Wildlife Catalog can cover ground on 2 legs. The head profile is visible in the infrared, the elongated muzzle and the erect pointed ears, and the body proportions match what Merle described from the cage in 1967. Whether the creature in the footage is the same individual that was captured 56 years ago, or an offspring, or a different member of a population that has occupied these hollows for far longer than anyone has been documenting, Merle cannot say. What he can say is that the physical characteristics and the behavioral patterns have remained consistent across his entire observation period, which spans more than 4 decades. The connection between what happened on Merle's family property in 1967 and the broader Dogman phenomenon only became clear to Merle only in the 2000s. When the internet gave him access to reports and research that did not exist in the decades when he was carrying this alone. He found Linda Godfrey's work. He found the Michigan reports. He found the documented encounter from Wexford County in 1887, when 2 lumberjacks described a creature with a man's body and a dog's head in the logging camps along the Manistee River. He found Steve Cook's song The Legend, recorded as an April Fool's prank in 1987 at a radio station in Traverse City, Michigan, a song that was supposed to be a joke until the phone started ringing with calls from people who had seen exactly what the song described. He found the land between the lakes accounts. He found reports from the Pacific Northwest, from Appalachia, from the Great Plains, and he realized that what his family had caught in a cage trap in a hollow in Newton County, Arkansas, was not a one-off anomaly. It was a known phenomenon that people had been encountering and describing with remarkable consistency for at least 150 years, probably longer, probably much longer. The Ozarks have their own history with this. The Osage people, who claimed the region that includes Newton County until 1808, were a Degiha-Siwan-speaking nation whose territory stretched across much of what is now Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The Osage lived in the Ozark Highlands for centuries. They hunted the same hollows and ridgelines where Merle finds tracks today. In 2023, at the request of the Osage Nation, the United States Geological Survey named the highest peak in the Ozark Mountains, located in Newton County, Wahaze Summit, using the Osage people's name for themselves. That naming was an acknowledgement that the Osage connection to this land runs deeper than any treaty or boundary line. The Osage understood the Ozark forests and hollows as occupied terrain, inhabited by presences that were known, named in their own language, and respected through practices that governed how and where humans moved through the landscape. When Merle told me that several older Ozark residents at the animal show in 1967 looked at the creature with recognition rather than surprise, he was describing a tradition of knowledge that predates European contact by centuries. The old-timers in Newton County, people whose families had been in these hollows since the 1830s, had absorbed fragments of that older knowledge through generations of sharing the same landscape. They had words for things in the deep hollows. They did not use those words in mixed company. And when they saw the creature in the cage, they did not need anyone to explain what it was. The behavioral profile Merle documented matches what Godfrey cataloged across hundreds of cases: nocturnal activity, territorial marking, association with ridgelines, creek drainages, limestone formations, awareness of human technology, coordinated vocalizations suggesting social organization, deliberate avoidance of human contact, and the intelligence. The intelligence is what Merle comes back to, because it separates what he is dealing with from any known predator. Whatever lives in those hollows found and destroyed cameras concealed inside hollow logs and rock crevices, cameras that required pattern recognition to locate. It adjusted its movement patterns in response to Merle's schedule. It learned his routines. It understood his purpose. That understanding is what I have thought about more than anything else in Merle's account. 18 days in a cage, watching everything, memorizing faces, testing the locking pin with the same deliberate motion every day, and on the night it escaped, targeting the 3 men responsible for its captivity with a precision that implied planning. It killed 3 specific people, looked at the boy who had brought its food, decided the boy was not a captor, and left. That is judgment, the ability to distinguish between individuals based on role and behavior. It is the most disturbing piece of evidence in this case, because it implies a cognitive capacity with implications for every other encounter report in the Dogman catalog. If the creature in Merle's cage could learn faces, distinguish between captors and non-captors, plan an escape, execute that plan with tactical efficiency, and then make a deliberate decision to spare a child, then every other report of Dogman behavior that involves restraint, that involves warning rather than attack, that involves a creature letting a human leave its territory unharmed, takes on a different meaning. The restraint is not the absence of aggression. It is the presence of decision-making. The creature is choosing. Every encounter where a witness walks away alive is an encounter where something decided to let them walk away. That distinction matters enormously, because it means the creatures are not simply animals following instinct. They are intelligences making real-time assessments about individual humans and individual situations, and they are acting on those assessments with a consistency that suggests shared behavioral norms, either learned culturally or transmitted across generations. What the 1967 incident cost Merle personally is a story about what happens when the central event of your life is an experience nobody will believe, and you cannot escape. His father was dead. The family friend, a man Merle had known his entire childhood, was dead. The hired hand was dead. His mother moved him to Little Rock and never spoke about the incident again. She died in 1991 without ever having discussed it with Merle beyond the first few weeks of grief. The marriage that Merle's mother had, the life she had built around the animal show and the property and the family, was destroyed by the creature's escape, and she handled the destruction by erasing it as completely as she could. She did not keep photographs from the show. She did not keep records. She did not talk about Newton County. When Merle told her in his mid-20s that he was moving back to the property, she said nothing. He said the silence on the phone was the loudest thing he had ever heard from her. Merle married in his early 30s. The marriage lasted 12 years. His wife knew something was wrong but could not get him to say what. He lived with the knowledge sealed inside him, and it pressed down on everything. He could not explain the hours in the woods, the map on the wall, the trail cameras, the late nights on the porch listening to sounds she could not hear. When she finally demanded an explanation, he told her, She did not believe him. The marriage ended within the year. That isolation is something I encounter in nearly every credible Dogman witness I have spoken with. The knowledge is a dividing line. On one side are the people who know. On the other side is everyone else. You cannot cross that line by showing someone footage or pointing at tracks. You can only cross it by seeing the thing yourself. Merle has had one confidant for the past 20-some years, a man we will call Lonnie. Lonnie owns land adjacent to Merle's property on the east side, and he has his own history with the hollows south of the Buffalo River. Lonnie contacted us separately to corroborate specific details of Merle's account, and his testimony was consistent with Merle's in ways that would be very difficult to fabricate. Lonnie has heard the vocalizations from his own property. He has found tracks on his land that match the ones Merle has been documenting. On a night in the fall of 2020, Lonnie was sitting on his back porch after dark when he saw something cross his pasture on two legs at a distance of roughly 80 yards, moving south toward the tree line. He said the shape was tall, broad, and wrong in a way that he could feel in his body before his brain could process the visual information. He did not see the head clearly. He saw enough of the silhouette to know it was not a bear, not a deer, not a person, and not anything else he had ever seen in Newton County. He went inside, locked his door, and called Merle. Merle was not surprised. He told Lonnie what he had been finding for decades and what it meant, and for the first time in over 40 years, Merle had someone who believed him because Lonnie had seen it for himself. Lonnie's corroboration matters because it addresses the obvious question. Is Merle reliable after decades of carrying a childhood trauma? Lonnie's independent observations from an adjacent property provide external validation that cannot be staged. He is not a Dogman researcher. He is a retired man living on his family's land who saw something cross his pasture one night that he cannot explain. The institutional silence around what Merle has documented operates with particular efficiency in Newton County because the county's economy depends on tourism. The Buffalo National River draws over 1 million visitors per year. The canoe outfitters, the lodges, the campgrounds, the restaurants in Jasper and Ponca, the elk herd in Boxley Valley that brings photographers from across the country. Reports of a large unidentified bipedal predator would not be helpful to any of that. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission's species inventory for Newton County includes black bear, deer, elk, turkey, bobcat, coyote, gray fox, and the occasional mountain lion. There is no field in their database for an unidentified bipedal canid. No form, no code, no checkbox. If Merle walked into the office in Jasper and presented his 40 years of observations, the system would have no place to put them. The National Park Service, which administers the Buffalo National River and its 95,000 acres, does not respond to reports of large bipedal canines because those reports do not exist within the framework of their operations. If a hiker on the Steel Creek Trail reported an upright canine-headed creature, the ranger who took the report would have no protocol for handling it. The report would go into a file, the file into a drawer, and the hiker would be told it was probably a bear on its hind legs. Merle knows all of this. It is why he has never filed a report. The system cannot process what he has found, and the people within the system cannot acknowledge it without risking their credibility. What Merle hopes for now is simple. He wants the evidence to outlast him. He wants the journal, the map, the footage, the 4 decades of observation to survive after he is gone and be available to whoever eventually takes this seriously enough to study it properly. The question of why the creature killed the handlers but has shown restraint in every encounter since is something Merle has thought about for over 50 years, and his answer is the most thought-provoking piece of analysis I have heard from any witness. He said the killing was not predation. It was retribution. The creature was captured, caged, hauled, and displayed. It was held against its will by specific individuals who it could identify and distinguish from other humans. When it escaped, it punished its captors, and then it stopped. It went back to the forest and resumed the existence it had been living before it was caught. An existence defined by territory, avoidance of human contact, and a relationship with the landscape that predates human presence in the Ozarks by however many centuries or millennia these creatures have been here. The restraint that followed is what separates this from any predator incident on record. A bear that kills a handler is tracked down and destroyed because the behavior is expected to recur. The creature from Merle's cage killed 3 men and then spent the next 57 years avoiding human contact with a deliberateness that can only mean one thing. It understood the killing as a specific response to a specific situation. It drew a line. The captors crossed it. The consequences were terminal. And then the line went back to where it had been. And as long as humans stayed on their side, the creature stayed on its. That reading aligns with what Dogman researchers have documented across the country. The creatures maintain territory through warning, not violence, tree marking, vocalizations, camera destruction, brief proximity displays, followed by withdrawal. The violence in Merle's case was provoked by captivity, an act that violated the fundamental terms of the territorial relationship. The creature attacked the specific humans who took its freedom, attacked them once, and then returned to the pattern of avoidance that defines Dogman behavior in every credible report I have examined. The implication is uncomfortable. It suggests these creatures have something close to a concept of justice, an understanding of causation connecting a specific action, being caged, with a specific consequence, retribution against the individuals responsible. That is cognition that challenges assumptions about the boundary between human and animal intelligence. And it is consistent with what indigenous traditions across the continent have said about these beings for centuries, that they occupy a category the Western framework does not have a name for, and that treating them as simple predators is a misunderstanding that can be fatal. As Merle's family learned in 1967, Merle asked me one thing at the end of our last conversation. He asked me not to give specific directions to the hollows south of his property, not to name the exact drainage, not to provide coordinates or landmarks that would allow someone to find the area. His reason was not personal safety. His reason was the same one that comes up in nearly every Dogman case where the witness has spent significant time observing the creatures. He is protecting them. He has spent 45 years documenting the evidence of their presence, and in that time he has come to understand something about them that most people who hear this story will miss. They were there first. The hollows and the ridgelines and the creek bottoms and the limestone caves that run through the Boston Mountains of Newton County belong to them in a way that is older and more fundamental than any deed or survey or county boundary. They were on this ground before the Osage, before the Cherokee, before the white settlers moved in during the 1830s, before the county was created, or the highway was paved, or the river was designated. They have been here for a span of time that makes human occupation of the Ozarks look like a brief interruption. And they will be here after the last lodge closes, and the last trail is overgrown, and the last section of Highway 7 crumbles into the hollow it was carved through. Merle said he thinks about that night in 1967 every day. He said the image of the creature standing in the yard light, looking up at his window, is the most important moment of his life, and he has spent 57 years trying to understand what it means. His father trapped it and caged it and paid for that decision with his life. Merle fed it and brought it water and treated it as a living thing rather than a captive. And the creature distinguished between those two relationships in the moment of its escape and acted accordingly. It killed its captors and spared the boy who had shown it a measure of decency. Merle does not know whether that reading is accurate. He does not know whether the creature's decision was based on his behavior, or on his size, or on some calculation he cannot fathom. He knows that he is alive and 3 men are not, and that the difference between his fate and theirs was a decision made by something that most people believe does not exist. The evidence is sitting in Merle's house in Newton County. Over 30 trail camera clips, decades of journal entries, hundreds of marks on a topographic map, photographs of tracks and territorial markings, audio recordings of vocalizations. It is one of the most sustained records of Dogman activity at a single location that I have ever encountered. And it exists because a 15-year-old boy watched something kill his father in the yard light of an Ozark farmstead and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what it was and why it let him live. The creature is still in those hollows. The 2023 footage confirms what the tracks and the markings and the vocalizations have been confirming for decades. Something is living in the deep terrain south of the Buffalo River, in the limestone caves and the hardwood bottoms where the silence has a quality that any experienced woodsman will tell you means the woods are occupied. Merle is in his early 70s. He lives alone on the property where his father died. He checks his trail cameras every 2 weeks. He walks the fence line and looks for tracks. He sits on his porch after dark sometimes and listens to the hollows, and sometimes hears the sounds that have carried up from the south side of the ridge since 1967. The structured low-frequency vocalizations that rise and fall in patterns that have the cadence of communication without any language he can decipher. He does not know how many creatures are in the drainage. Based on size variation in the tracks he has measured over the decades, he estimates at least 3, possibly more, a population. Something that has been breeding and sustaining itself in the Ozark backcountry for longer than anyone has been counting. He told me one more thing before we ended our last conversation. He said that in the fall of 2024, he walked out to the old trap site, the hollow where his father had set the cage trap in September of 1967. He had not been down there in years. The trail was overgrown. The hollow was deep in leaf fall and smelled like wet limestone and decay, and the particular sweetness that the Ozark forest produces in autumn when the hardwoods are letting go and the understory is thick with fern and moss. He found the remains of the old trap. The frame had rusted down to a few recognizable pieces of angle iron and mesh wire, half buried in leaves and soil. He stood there looking at it for a long time. Then he noticed the tree behind it, a white oak, maybe 30 inches in diameter, that had not been large enough to notice in 1967, but had grown over the intervening decades into a substantial tree. The trunk was marked, fresh gouges in the bark, vertical scratches running from about 4 feet off the ground to just over 7, in groups of 4, deep and clean, the exposed wood still pale. Territorial markings, the same kind he had been documenting on his property for 40 years. On the tree directly behind the location where the creature had been captured 57 years ago, Merle put his hand on the bark between the marks. He stood there in the hollow and listened to the forest and heard nothing and everything. The woods were quiet. The creek was running. The wind moved through the canopy above him in a sound that is the oldest sound in the Ozarks, older than the Osage, older than the bluff shelters, older than the name that anyone has ever given to anything that lives here. He said he does not know what the markings on that tree mean. He does not know whether the creature that left them is the same individual that was in the cage, now approaching 60 years old, if that is even a meaningful number for whatever these things are. He does not know whether the markings are a territorial boundary, a warning, a memorial, or something he does not have a word for. He knows that something went back to the exact spot where it was captured over half a century ago and left its mark on the tree that stands there now. And he knows that whatever that gesture means, it means the creature remembers. The cage is rust in the leaves. The men who built it are in the ground. The boy who brought the water is an old man now, living on land that holds a story nobody will tell and a presence nobody will acknowledge. And in the hollows below him, something moves through the limestone and the hardwoods and the silence with the same unhurried authority it has always carried, older than the county, older than the treaties, older than the names we have given to the mountains and the rivers, and the things we think we understand about what lives in them. The footage exists, the evidence exists, the marks on the trees exist, and the creature that made them exists, in the deep places where the Boston Mountains fold into hollows that no road has ever reached, and no survey has ever mapped, and no authority has ever acknowledged as anything other than empty forest. It is not empty. It has never been empty. And the people who have lived closest to it, the Osage and the old Ozark families and the handful of men and women who have seen it with their own eyes, have always known that. They just learned, a long time ago, that some kinds of knowledge are safer left unspoken, carried quietly through a lifetime and passed along in fragments to the few people willing to sit still long enough to hear what the hollows have been saying all along.